What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, we speak with cybersecurity expert and a pioneering voice in the field of cyber safety, Josh Corman. Josh is the founder of IamTheCavalry.org, an advocacy group actively engaged in addressing some of the most pressing issues of public safety and threats to human life on the internet today. He is the director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council and part of the 2016 Cybersecurity Task Force commissioned by the United States Congress in order to address the growing risk to our hospitals, medical infrastructure, and connected devices from cyber attacks. In this episode, we jack directly into cyberspace, a world of zeros and ones zooming across the network at light speed. This is not your grandmother's internet. Gone are the quaint, innocent days of pesky Trojans, macro viruses, rats, slammer worms, and blaster worms. Today's cyber landscape features a wide assortment of easily accessible and robust attack tools, exploiting vulnerabilities from software bugs like Shellshock and Heartbleed to DDoS and PDoS attacks comprised of webcams, internet-enabled refrigerators, and DVRs. The use of ransomware tools like CryptoLocker and SamSam have become billion-dollar criminal industries. Cybercrime is estimated to cost the global economy hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars a year. And yet, we accept the losses as the simple cost of doing business. But what about when the costs of these crimes escalates from dollars and cents to flesh and blood? What are the risks to our industrial control systems? What about our aviation and emergency response infrastructure? What are the vulnerabilities in our connected devices, our cars, and our hospitals? Most importantly, what do we do about it? As always, you can gain access to reading lists put together by me ahead of every episode by visiting the show's website at Hidden Forces Pod. If you are listening to the show on iTunes or Android, make sure to subscribe. If you like the show, write us a review. And if you want a sneak peek into how the sausage is made, or for special storylines told through pictures and questions, then like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod. Lastly, I will be taking the next 2 weeks off as part of my prep and production of the next batch of shows. In the meanwhile, you can check in on my progress and get updates on upcoming guests by following me and the show on social media. And now, time for this week's conversation. All right, so Josh Corman, man, long lost brother. I was saying to you before we started that it feels like I've known you now forever. We spent the last few hours together, got some sandwiches, went to Bryant Park. You did an interview with NBC.
It's a beautiful day in the park.
Beautiful day in the park. You were a real New Yorker today, man. You pumped out a lot of stuff.
I think you're all trying to trick me to move here. I don't think my family would like that.
How long was your trip to get down here?
I was already halfway here.
You were?
Yeah.
All right, you're very kind.
A couple hours.
You're very, very, very kind. I'm very excited to have you on, Josh, man. So you and I don't normally have this opportunity with guests, but with you, we spoke at length about, and I'm familiar with what you do from having read some of your stuff. I am the Cavalry, looking at some of your videos online, your talk at DEF CON, a TED Talk, TEDx. Where was that TEDx talk that you gave?
Chicago.
Yeah. How was that for you, TEDx?
It was for a reason I'll tell you some other time. It was emotionally challenging, but it was really satisfying.
Did it take a long time for you to get good speaking in front of people?
I think one of my gifts is sincere. So I just don't think about it. You just try to be sincere and passionate, and it can compensate for other things. I like to watch the audience and see what resonates and adjust as necessary. Faster, slower, more detail, less detail.
Well, you're going to have to use your imagination today because we don't have an audience.
But I have you.
You have me. That's right. And I'm super excited, man. All right. So so I've always sort of nibbled around the edges of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, surveillance. All that stuff has interested me. But I got into it a lot in the last year or two. And I got into it initially because I was genuinely concerned about the scale and scope of government surveillance. So that's how I got into it. The Snowden stuff really, and it wasn't like I was sleeping before Snowden. I knew what was going on, but that obviously was a big data dump, and subsequently that's been happening. But what I've come to realize is that the threat posed by our insecurity in cyberspace is so much broader than just privacy rights or corporate pilfering or whatever. So today, I mean, in my view, there are three main areas. One is government surveillance, that whole sort of issue, to get your arms around it, like what's going on there, what are our rights, how much is too much, security for liberty, et cetera, or liberty for security, et cetera. There's the corporate side, which is the lawful pilfering of our data, the Facebooks, the Googles, Apple, et cetera. And then there's this sort of Wild West world of what is possible in terms of what criminal or extrajudicial groups can do, or lone wolves, or I think terrorism kind of goes in that area as well. When I think about governments, I think much more in terms of government on government or government against citizen. This is a really terrifying space. So, when I first contacted you, I was really interested in talking about autonomous driving vehicles and some of these other traditional areas where we associate with hacking. But you kind of really brought me onto a whole new level of understanding around where the biggest vulnerabilities were. And we're going to get into all those details today. But to start off, why don't you give us, and we're also going to get into, I should say for our audience, because Josh's background is, or his daily application of his skills deals around problem solving. So what's really great is we're not just going to talk about problems, we're also going to get into solutions. But I want to lay out the problem or the problems. I want to really focus on that. So why don't you kind of give our audience sort of an overview of what you think the problem is that we face, or the threat we face, or the issue we face with technology, with the internet, with connectivity in contemporary digital society.
So an easy problem.
Yeah, an easy problem.
We'll start off really easy. The balance here is going to, for our tone, is going to be challenging because we want to raise the alarm without being alarmist. There's a lot to be concerned about. Things are getting a lot worse. We don't want to drive people to fear, and we don't want people to just magically think these are going to be okay. So these are some tough topics, and if we're going to talk about it in a sincere and candid, forthright way, some of them will be uncomfortable. Just know that we're getting to the place where we're finally ready to have the uncomfortable conversations. One way I try to characterize this is modern society depends on steel and concrete, right? We're in a skyscraper right now. We're not sitting in perpetual fear that this building is going to collapse upon us. Well, when we weren't paying attention, we're starting to become as dependent on software as we are on steel and concrete. But it's not nearly as reliable. In fact, it's infinitely vulnerable.
Why?
They call it software for a reason, not specifically this reason, but it's very malleable. And we don't know how to write secure software. We still don't know how to do so. There's a certain defect rate for every 1,000 lines of code you have, and modern software is in the millions of lines of code.
And Apollo 11's guidance system was 145,000 lines of code.
That's right. So software has flaws in it inherently. It's a brittle material. We can do a lot with it, but it's also very vulnerable. And a fear I've had for quite some time is that our dependence on software is growing a lot faster than our ability to secure it. And it's one thing when it's your credit card or your corporate information, because so far those losses have been tolerable losses. There haven't been high consequence failures.
How high have those losses been? Like, what's the sort of general estimate for what the financial cost of hacking has been year by year or over the decade or whatever?
I mean, some of the estimates strain credulity, but one of the ways I like to put this is, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but only a little bit, about 100 of the Fortune 100 have lost intellectual property and trade secrets in the last few years. And nearly every PCI-compliant payment card industry credit card merchant has lost your credit cards.
And are you also bundling into that sort of state-sponsored hacks, like China or some of these other countries that work with their corporations to pilfer the data of other U.S. companies?
Yeah, over time we're getting new classes of adversaries and new motivations. But for a long, long time, it was just financial crime. Yes, you saw nation-state-sponsored espionage pilfering intellectual property from the U.S. to China, for example, until the agreement cessation of that. But if you think about that on a long enough timeline, our success rate is basically zero. right? Our failure rate's 100%. And people haven't recognized that. So we think we're doing a good job in cybersecurity, but if you really take a zoom back, we've failed nearly everywhere. It's just okay when it's a replaceable thing like a credit card. Who cares? Maybe it's $50 penalty to you. Maybe it's an inconvenience, and it happens a couple times a year to most people. They've become numb to it. But even OPM, which is the Office of Personnel Management, that was a fairly serious attack, but it still wasn't serious enough to trigger corrective action and policy changes.
Those were the government email hacks.
Yeah, it was the OPM looks at the background and information and only in personal information when you get clearances. So pretty devastating. But thus far, none of these failures have been high consequence enough to trigger a corrective action. But in parallel with that, we're now putting that vulnerable software into our cars, our medical devices, our hospitals, our trains, our air traffic control. So if we can't defend it on low consequence things, why do we think this is safe for where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood? And, we noticed this a few years ago, got very motivated, and we wanted to drive our talents and our knowledge into these safety critical industries before we had really high consequence failures measured in a loss of life and a crisis of confidence in GDP. Healthcare is 20% of the economy. What happens when people no longer trust their connected vehicles or they no longer trust their insulin pump? So we're in a position where we already have material weaknesses in a lot of these places, and we're adding more every day, but we haven't caught up to the cost benefit. We know why we do it. We know the benefits we get out of it. We've not calculated the cost and the risks.
And for our audience, like when they hear the term IoT, that, and to clarify with you, Josh, IoT is really the commercial, the popular name for the commercial application of networked technologies. But what we're talking about here is any networked application or technology. So, we don't think of a hooked up MRI machine as being IoT, but I mean that's what it is, and it's the ability to transmit and or receive data. But of course, it's the reception aspect that makes it vulnerable.
Yeah, one of the ways I put this is if it has software, it's vulnerable, and if it has a network connection, it's exposed. So we've had software and things for quite some time, but the volume and variety of connectivity is what's made things really bad.
Because and also it's important to note, a lot of that software that was created, much of it, in fact, we're going to get into that with HIPAA. A lot of that software was written without any intention or expectation that the type of security now required would be required, because there was no notion of it being connected to the internet.
Right.
All right. So let's start running through some of the big problems, and I want to start with the one that you've identified, I think, and educated me on, which I did not realize just how insanely vulnerable and exposed this particular area of society is: medical devices and hospitals.
Yeah.
That it seems to me that you're the one that. Okay, so why don't you tell us why you're most nervous about that?
So there's a number of ways to approach this, but if you think about connected technologies that can directly affect human life, there's several you can imagine, right? There's our cars, our trains, our power grid, things like that. In most cases, to have harm, you need some sort of vulnerability and weakness that meets either an accident or an adversary. And most of the skill required to attack a power grid or, hack an airplane or, stop all the cars on the highway at the same time, that's going to take some level of technical skill, less than you might think, but it still takes some level of technical skill and investment. So that's going to isolate the total number of adversaries to maybe nation states or really well-funded bad guys. One of the things that's unique about the health industry is most of the modern healthcare industry is based on Windows. Not just Windows, really
Microsoft
old
Windows.
Yeah, Microsoft Windows, Windows XP, things that are really vulnerable, has far fewer defenses than modern operating systems, and is technically no longer supported. So you can't even get patches for these in a lot of cases. So if you were a low-skilled adversary, you could do serious damage because it's very familiar. Existing hacking tools, existing scripts.
Exploits, known vulnerabilities that are available. And there are huge bazaars online available for these exploits, and people being able to buy tools, I don't even know the terminology to describe it, but so the older, what you're saying is essentially the older the software, and also the more out of date, the less likely there are to be patches.
Right. So if you think about adversaries from a completely unskilled adversary, I could teach you right now in less than an hour how to use some free tools. And I'm not saying that you're not intelligent, but you've never hacked before, right?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
totally.
So within probably an hour, you could be very damaging with free legal attack tools. And so that is the lower bounds of how much talent you need to have. And I think a lot of the public believes that hacking is really, really hard. And some of the hacking is really, really hard. And some of it's very admirable. And you have to be a world-class hacker to maybe jailbreak an iPhone. But some of the other ones are really, really easy to do. Once there's a known flaw, there's a known attack, and then you just basically hit a button and you can go in some of these tools. And those are the ones that scare me, because if it's available to anyone with the willpower to use it, we like to talk in terms, like in crime, you say you need the combination of means, motive, and opportunity.
Is it fair to say that the difference between writing HTML code to build your website versus building it on Squarespace, is that a fair comparison for some of these tools in terms of their ease, or are they even easier?
That's not a bad analogy. Once someone inventing the exploit is hard, inventing the attack framework might be hard. Using it is getting easier and easier. We say it's lowering the barriers to entry.
So let's go through some examples in hospitals and with medical equipment that the areas that concern you most. Examples of known hacks, like Hollywood Hospital. Let's go through that.
A few years ago, I'm trying to think how many, maybe 5 years ago now, some of our friends started hacking insulin pumps and pacemakers and the like, and they were just trying to see if they could do it. And that took a little learning curve because they're special devices. But they're good.
And these are using now these devices. These particular devices are using things like Bluetooth. This is how you're hacking into these particular devices, right? The insulin pump's not Wi-Fi. You still have to be physically close to the device, right?
Yeah, Jay Radcliffe is a diabetic. He researched his own insulin pump, and he found he could give himself a lethal dose over the short range Bluetooth stack. Which
means if someone that's a personal target. That's where you can target someone personally,
either specifically or anyone who comes within range.
Right. Exactly. So you actually could be sitting at Penn Terminal.
That's right.
And just for the lulls.
Those were just initial, can I do it? These are the white hat hackers that were doing it for, some curiosity, some puzzling, maybe to get famous a little bit. In Jay's case, he's also a patient, so he actually cared about his well-being. And he couldn't actually find an insulin pump he trusted, so he ended up going back to manual injections after a while.
Well, Dick Cheney got his heart thing, his whole thing out back in like the Bush administration.
Well, he wanted a pacemaker without a remote
without
interface.
Bluetooth.
It was.
I remember when the video of the video of him coming out of the hospital, like after it was done, they finally said it. Anyway.
Well, yeah, and everyone thinks it's Bluetooth, but Bluetooth battery life isn't very good, so they use a different local protocol. But it's the idea that once you add a remote access to it, if you don't design it securely, if you don't do a lot of testing, you might be opening up a vector for accidents and adversaries. In fact, Jay, his original inspiration to research this is he changed the battery before he went to sleep. And it forgot that he had just given him a dose. So it didn't,
wow.
So it gave him an extra dose. His wife had to call an ambulance, and he said, wow, if a software glitch can almost kill me, I wonder if I could kill me. And he found it was a lot easier than he expected. So we started looking at individual medical devices. We started working with the Food and Drug Administration. It took a lot less technical prowess and a lot more empathy and translating and educating bidirectionally. But eventually we got to a point where we've been working pretty intensely between the white hat community, the FDA, and all the other stakeholders. And we're finally gotten guidance over the last 2 years for the FDA's expectations on medical device manufacturers to make these things more prepared for failure. We wrote a document called the Hippocratic Oath for Connected Medical Devices, which basically was a companion to our automotive one. And it said all systems fail. Here's 5 ways you need to handle failure. And if you can't, we wanted to basically say you must be this tall to ride the Internet of medical things. And slowly but surely they wove in many of those requirements into their formal guidance. So I think we started feeling pretty good that we were on a path for medical devices to start to be less vulnerable than their predecessors. But then Congress asked for, in the CISA law, the Computer Information Sharing Act, they wanted a 1-year cybersecurity task force for health and human services for hospitals. So I was named to that based on the work we did with the FDA, and there's 20 of us. Some of them are large and small hospitals, large and small device manufacturers, and we have a year to give back a report to Congress, and we're just about done. I think the final draft is coming in my inbox tonight. But we found some really scary things because the general attitude I had
now
was
we're transitioning from the medical devices more to the hospitals, right?
Yeah. So we felt like we had started to get individual devices on a better path, and it's going to take several years for the research and development and the clinical trials for people to act on this new guidance. So the current amount of devices are pretty precarious. Some of these vulnerabilities are terrifying if we got into some of the details. But then we said, well, a hospital is going to be a mixture of network security and nurse stations and electronic medical records. So there's different larger challenges. Maybe they get a little better if we made the devices safer, but we have to also look at the clinical environment. And when we started looking there, it got really bad. In fact, after Congress asked for this, there was a piece of ransomware that hit Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Southern California last February, and they had to shut down patient care and divert ambulances to other facilities. Can you imagine if you're bleeding in the back of an ambulance and you have to go to a different facility? They canceled operations, they had to move patients. And that scared the bejesus out of me because it wasn't even a targeted attack. It was a piece of ransomware happened to land there. And
by ransomware, in other words, they were looking to basically say, give us X amount of money or we're going to screw up your systems.
I mean, there's lots of types of ransomware, but the simplified version is it lands on your computer, it encrypts your files or your system, and it says, pay us some number of Bitcoin and we'll unencrypt it for you. It wasn't targeting hospitals, but it happened to hit quite a few. Now, since then, financially motivated attackers.
And I should just say it's just so important for people to recognize how simple the concept is.
Oh, so simple.
The concept is so simple. I lock your stuff. I threaten to delete it all, in this particular example of it, or unless you pay me. And I have no guarantee. You have no guarantee that I'm going to release it for you anyway. And it's for people that's happened to, it is a devastating experience. It is you realize just how vulnerable you really are,
and it can happen over. It can happen over and over too.
Yeah, and our whole lives increasingly are digital, and if we lose that data, we lose so much. We could lose pictures, we could lose
family photos.
It's incredibly devastating, and it's not. It's just one example of many very simple-minded attacks that are possible because of the level of complexity, the software we're describing, the level of networked computing. Anyway, so continue about the hospitals where we were at.
So ransomware isn't very new, but the impact on a clinical environment is devastating. So if you can't get at your patient's blood types, how do you do a surgery? You need to know their blood type. And because we're so electronically dependent, when we used to have paper records, we were slower, maybe less efficient. There's reasons we went to electronic. But if we aren't having readily available backups, if you're not having paper alternatives or manual processes, the dependence on technology is really made us weak and vulnerable to pretty pronounced impact. In fact, I often like to talk in terms that security is a measure of dependence, right? If you're if you're over dependent on something, you can either depend upon it less or make it more dependable. And right now we're doing neither, right? We're over depending and we're not making it resilient and robust. Ransomware is a really easy one. So this particular piece of ransomware is called SamSam. Most people just paid the ransom. It wasn't that big. But this particular hospital didn't have enough security staff or didn't react in time, so they got locked up and they had this impact. And to me, I said, look, if an accident can take out Hollywood Presbyterian for a week, what could a deliberate attacker do? And, I think we're going to talk about this at some point, but I researched the rise of Anonymous and hacktivism, and one of the guys at Anonymous went by Trick. He was in a group called Team Poison out of the UK. He's the guy who went to jail for hacking Tony Blair's stuff. Sometime in jail or after jail, he radicalized, joined ISIS, moved to Raqqa, Syria from the comfort of his Birmingham, UK origin, and was leading the cyber caliphate. So you have somebody who was not necessarily a highly talented hacker, but he was talented enough to take life. I mean, he might not have known how to hack, a power station, but he certainly knew how to hack unpatched Windows XP in a clinical environment. So these are really easy to do because the relative security and defense at a hospital is really, really low. The equipment's really, really old. It's over-connected for a bunch of reasons. And I said, if an accident can take out a hospital, what could someone like Trick do?
So let's stop again and really let that sink in. The vulnerability is there, and here we just found motivation, which is we have this existing terrorist ideology, terrorism, and you have there's no reason that you can't have more people like that are smart, that are capable. The notion of the terrorist being this dumb guy with a gun or the pack of explosives just blowing him or herself up is antiquated, and it doesn't take into account. And he, in fact, this guy Trick was the first guy to be killed by the first cyber terrorist to be killed by a drone strike. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the belief. He was killed in August of let me see, a year and a half ago now. So in Raqqa, Syria. And, there's debate over how much of it was because of his potential to hack and train people to hack versus how effective he was at recruiting, use of social media. You remember the Garland, Texas attacks, the physical attacks. Those were orchestrated in part by Trick, or at least he took credit for it. So this guy, Junaid Hussain, was his real name. I said to myself, look, if one of the many, activists can radicalize out of 7 billion human beings, we're kind of hoping that nobody has the willpower to take human life. So I was very grateful that he was dead before he could have noticed this, but he did train and recruit people.
Well, he was at conferences that you were at.
Yeah, we never know which conferences he was at, but we wondered, right?
Right.
I mean, when I did the anonymous research, eventually several key members of the global movement eventually introduced themselves to me in person. Not everybody, but some of the key members. So when I heard that he was killed, I said, I wonder if I've met that guy.
From what I understand, and this number you gave me, about 3/4 of hospitals don't have a security person on staff dealing with cybersecurity. And also, hospitals don't have robust firewalls. You can explain for our audience much better than I can, but let's talk about kind of the issues with the perimeters around the hospitals and the issue with not having technical expertise within the hospital to deal with the security issues.
This is an oversimplification, but one of the ways I like to say this is the big surprises. Now, the task force report isn't done. It's going to go to Congress. I think we're going to release it the first week of May. And this is not the entirety of the report, but the ones that really stick with me in the findings of our 12 months were, number one, the overwhelming majority of health delivery organizations are small, medium, and rural. And many of them have 9 or fewer employees, or the next tranche is about 100 or fewer employees. And when you look at that kind of a hospital or health delivery environment, they have 0 security staff. They might not even have a single IT person. And that means there's no one there to act on these security threats or to respond to them that's qualified.
What are we talking about here when we're talking about these type of places? Like, what would be an example?
I mean, it could be a very few bed hospital. It could be a blood clinic. It doesn't have to be a hospital. HDO is a health delivery organization. But statistically, unless you're getting these massive consolidations or these networks, there's really no security staff. What they do to be compliant with privacy laws like HIPAA is they designate an information security officer, but they seldom have any security training. It's someone who has a different job who's designated as the information security officer, and that's only for privacy. It doesn't really count cyber safety or hygiene or care and feeding for the patches of these devices. So the first one is it's rare to find a qualified security professional, and we're doing a lot more to protect banks. Like, here's a contrast point. Here we are in New York City. One of the testimonies to the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity was J.P. Morgan Chase. It was Greg Rattray, and he said, we have 2,000 full-time security people and a $600 million security budget per year, and we're still compromised. You've seen them in the news, right? And they do a great job, but with that level of investment, they're still compromised. But in an area that has life and death consequences that we depend upon in a physical attack or a physical tragedy, there's many hospitals that have 0. And even if they have staff, they don't have enough staff.
Is a fair way to think about that, the surface of potential vulnerable strike points is so large that it's just physically impossible to defend all of them in cyberspace?
Well, that's really the second big finding we had, which was irrespective of the talent you have, hospital networks are very flat and open, so they don't really have these big walls around them and perimeters. I mean, you mentioned firewalls. That's one of many technologies we use. But part of it is you need a security budget to buy those. You need a security staff, which we already talked about in number 1, to design and deploy them and manage them, and there's nobody there to do it. And there's other reasons that were perverse incentives from high tech, which is an extension of HIPAA, and this thing called meaningful use, where they essentially, even if you had staff to do it, it's hard to make these segmented and isolated like you would do at a bank.
And even if you have a firewall, you can still penetrate a firewall.
Firewalls are very porous. Yeah. But, whether it's GE or other medical equipment wants to remotely access these things for maintenance, there's holes in the firewall.
Whoa, let's talk about that, man, because that's the part. I mean, that goes into HIPAA. So let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, what is HIPAA? And then let's talk about the way that HIPAA has had this perverse effect, unintended, with respect to internet-connected devices and how it. Why don't you just go ahead there, because you're way better on this than I am.
Well, I'll try to avoid jargon, even though there's some medical jargon in here. It's not even cyber jargon. But HIPAA was really about the health information privacy, right? HIPAA. Then came this thing called HITECH, which is a different acronym. One of the things in HITECH was to accelerate the adoption of electronic health records. So instead of having paper copies, which were costly, lose them, it would take a while to transfer them. The government really wanted to see accelerated adoption of electronic health records. So they attached reimbursement to this term called meaningful use, and there's 3 different phases to it. But basically what it did is, to qualify for reimbursement, I'm oversimplifying, you had to receive and transmit electronic records.
So government reimbursement for your equipment.
Yeah. Now, if you look at what that did, it took all these devices that were never designed or threat modeled or architected to ever be connected to anything, and it kind of forced them to be connected to everything. So everybody slapped connectivity on these. It was very brittle and poorly done from a networking perspective, but absolutely insecure. If you were going to design a medical device to be naked on the internet and secure against all accidents and adversaries, you would do a lot of different design choices than taking that really old Windows XP system and making it receive and transmit.
What are some examples of those types of devices, equipment?
Well, a lot of the ones that are vulnerable to some of these ransomwares are electronic health record systems or electronic medical record systems that are more like the databases of your patient care records. Some of these things might be an MRI machine or imaging system. It could be a bedside infusion pump. There's all sorts of different connectivity that happen. And ultimately, we're going to save money by having more connected devices. We're going to have more health and management of them if we are investing in the staff to do the health and management. In fact, some of the promise of this, one of the reasons the task force was formed is we already have the connected medicine. We want to get to this next round called precision medicine, where we're sharing more structured information across more hospitals and regions, ideally doing machine learning and AI, which I heard about on some of your other episodes, to maybe solve diseases that we haven't solved.
The correlation aspect, the ability to draw insights from correlating large dumps of data.
I mean, I look at this in terms of the promise and the peril, right? The promise of precision medicine is reduced cost, increased telemedicine, more patient participation in their records, more sharing, more machine learning. There's so many things we hope to get out of precision medicine. The question becomes, are we upside down in our mortgage? Do we have enough technical debt and security debt that we can't really achieve those promises because we're just adding more and more risk? And if there's a crisis of confidence in the public to trust these technologies, it's gone.
Well, I mean, that's what I would think about for cancer patients, let's say, who are getting chemo or radiation. How real is that threat? That the target area that you're targeting with your radiation or the dosage of your chemo. Now, obviously, you gave a really simple example, was just change people's blood type on their charts. That's a very simple, dumb attack. But what about something like that? Like, having your treatment plan altered. That's frightening. And I think just if that were to happen once, I think that's a great example. One terrorist attack happens in the United States where someone takes life, and that's devastating. It's devastating specifically for the people who lose the loved ones. But the rest of the country freaks out that 9 people are killed in some town in the country. And what would happen if one person getting chemo was killed because of a lethal dose that was a result of a hack? You know what I'm saying? And I think that gets to your point, which is that, it's not just a loss of life, it's a loss of confidence. People are going to hospitals for treatment for diseases, and they're already terrified, they're already scared, they're already worried because they're sick and they're ill. To have to go in there and to question whether the treatment is actually happening or, in fact, they're being poisoned in mass. And I'm not just using hyperbole, that's a risk. That's a legitimate risk.
I think the first attacks that shatter confidence in these won't be so sophisticated as like targeting one person's setting, because you're going to have to know how to get to that system, how to navigate that system, maybe change the integrity of the records in that system. A state-sponsored attacker could do that already. I mean, this is super easy to do if you know what you're doing. I think it's more likely going to be things like the Hollywood Presbyterian, where they just lock up the whole system or they destroy a bunch of very expensive medical equipment. One of the scenarios we ran since our very first meeting was April 16th or so. I was flying down from Boston, and everyone on the flight had a Boston Marathon jacket on. And I said, hey, guys, remember when the Boston Marathon bombing a couple years ago? And everyone's like, of course. I said, do you remember why the death count was so low? And they all said, sure. It was blocks away from some of the best medical facilities in the world. I said, so what if you do that attack and the Hollywood Presbyterian attack?
And now you're talking about something which is I don't even know if we can get into that, but it is the opportunity for coordination among the
logical and physical.
Oh my God!
Yeah. So that's not a sophisticated attack. That's just the denial of service. But if I ever turned evil, one thing you would do to cast these systems in doubt is just randomize everybody's blood types.
I mean,
so we already did number one, which is there's very little security talent. There's a severe talent shortage for cost and availability of talent. Number two, they're wide open networks, more open than traditional stuff, in part because there's no staff and in part because of the meaningful use cause premature connectivity and over-connectivity. The third one is, we hinted at it, but a lot of these systems are very, very old and unsupported. So at Windows XP systems and older, and that was written in 2003 and it's been end-of-lifed and no technical support anymore unless you pay a ton of extra through private contracts.
That's insane. That's just totally crazy.
Then the last two are a single vulnerability took out Hollywood Presbyterian, and since then, the UK government shut down several hospitals in November and January for similar reasons. And the last point is, if you grab an average device, or one of our friends, Billy Rios, he looked at a single device and found over 1,400 known vulnerabilities in it. So if the average device has over 1,000 vulnerabilities, they're wide open, no one's maintaining them, and a single flaw in a single device can take out a hospital, this is why I'm deeply concerned.
What was the website that we went on?
Showdown?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what you're kind of touching on right there as well, right? And what were those operating systems, or what was it?
So I took you to Showdown.
Showdown.
Showdown is a web
Showdown.com.
search.
Or .net. What was it?
.io. Showdown.io.
.io.
Showdown is a web browser search engine, but not for browser pages, but for connected devices. So remember Stuxnet? Stuxnet attacked programmable logic controllers, Siemens Industrial Control Systems.
I want to talk about Stuxnet.
We will, but but any device they're looking for devices. So one of the things I had you search for was JBoss, JBOSS.
Right.
The SamSam ransomware used two methods. It used phishing, like tricking someone to click on something in email, or a known vulnerability in JBoss. So I showed you with one search you could find hospitals using JBoss. And as long as it was using the vulnerable version, with a second click in a tool called Metasploit, which is a free good guy attack tool, you could download the JBoss attack. And then with a third click, you point that attack at the first thing you found, and you've now just broken the law.
You don't need to know anything to do that. All you need to do is just want to do something bad.
Well, back to the means, motive, and opportunity. If you look at those three, for harm to happen, so the means to attack are becoming easier and easier and easier with tools like Showdown, Metasploit, and all sorts of other stuff. That's not even talking about deep web, dark market attack tools. Just simple tools. The means are becoming readily available. The opportunity is going towards infinity because we're adding software and connectivity to everything, including these safety critical things. So what we've really been missing is the motive. Who would take life, right? Most of the motive has been financial for criminals, or espionage for nation states, or spying, or propaganda for manipulation of elections. But if anyone can do this, you now need to include every motivation in the human condition, which includes terrorism, which includes
I'm having a bad day. I'm having a bad day.
Ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, stalkers. So we have made it very, very easy for any human being to assert themselves on everyone.
That's what makes this the scariest thing of all, and that's why we started with health, because focusing on the ease of the attack is proportionally related to the motivation. There's
probably a listener right now, because I have this every time we talk about this, that says, well, if it was that serious, it would have happened by now, right? And in fact, there's a cliche we have in cybersecurity. It's called security through obscurity is no security at all. So the idea that just because no one knows you're there is not a defense. But the truth is, we've seen time and time again, someone will find a flaw that has been there for 24 years. No one ever attacked it. But as soon as we learn of it, the predators pounce and they start attacking the bejesus out of it. So what happened in 2016 is that accidental ransomware that landed at Hollywood Presbyterian and a couple other 1,000 hospitals, the attackers took notice, and now they're doing deliberate ransomware. They're increasing the cost of the ransom. They're doing more nuanced and specific ransom. And they've always left it alone. So we were always prone, we were always prey, we just lacked predators. And that's changed. My bigger fear is the more aggressive ideological motivations are going to notice that. I hope they think it's hard to hack a hospital because that'll keep us safer for a little bit longer. But right now, that's a very, very thin level of protection.
Let's talk about autonomous driving vehicles because we're near that point. I mean, we're already there. I mean,
You're there.
We're there because Tesla's already there. I mean, right? You don't need. You're not supposed to, but you could take your hands and feet off the wheel, your feet off the pedal and the brakes, and you could go from here to wherever. That right now in a Tesla. So and there are a lot of things that feed into the autonomous driving vehicles that deal with traffic management and public utilities, et cetera. So we'll probably end up bleeding into those areas in this conversation. But let's talk about cars because of this fact. They are more difficult to hack, but they are
not a lot more.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the attack surface for cars. Let's talk about the vulnerabilities, et cetera.
All right, so I would like to separate the autonomous part out of it. It's really just that modern vehicles have more software and more connectivity. The autonomous adds some new elements and some new attack surface, but in general, most vehicles, even dumb cars, are becoming smart cars. If you buy one of those, aftermarket things from your insurer or from, the Verizon Hum, you can plug it into your OBD2 port. It's onboard diagnostics 2, and it's talking on the network of the car. So you took an unhackable car with no remote attack surface, and you made it hackable.
People love doing that.
So the general idea is, one of the ways I put this is, we know there's a certain defect rate per 1,000 lines of code. And is your point, what was the Apollo numbers?
145,000, I believe.
Put the Apollo space mission together. So if you look at that at Windows XP...
On Apollo 11. On 11. We went
right
to the moon with 145,000 lines of code.
So the Windows XP operating system we were bashing on earlier came out around 2003, was XP SP2 or so. That has about 10 million lines of code.
Yeah.
And think about how often you patch a Windows XP system. It's about once a month. It could be a dozen or more security flaws that get fixed every month. It's super, what is it called? Patch Tuesday. So there's a lot of flaws when you have 10 million lines of code. Now think of that frequency. A modern vehicle has 100 million lines of code. So why aren't we patching it 10 times more often than our Windows XP? So we've had software and a growing amount of software and complexity for a long time. And if we're measuring defects in thousands of lines of code, then you can just do the math.
Well, also, I should just say something for our audience. When you guys get updates to your software, you should patch those immediately. That's not just them randomly doing a little update to make your system more efficient. That's because they've usually found a vulnerability. You should always be patching software, always, 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 and you should have that. You should have that automatically done on your computer.
Oh, you're talking about your PC?
Yeah, well, computer, your PC, your anything and everything. If there's an update that's happened, and so people don't even make those updates when they can make them. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying is, in cars, it's not even possible for most of these vehicles.
Well, the culture wasn't conditioned, right? Mark Andreessen has that famous quote, "The software is eating the world." Well, as a cybersecurity guy, I hear it differently. I think software is infecting the world. We're putting software and connectivity into everything, and it makes it weaker. So it's not GM or Toyota or Honda's fault that one day they woke up and realized they were a software company. But they're not just a computer on wheels. They're a computer network on wheels. And we don't treat them with the maintenance and care that we treat our home PCs with. And the home PC isn't going to kill you.
Well, the example is the Jeep, right? They had to actually do the update through a dongle.
Yeah, so Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller have hacked several vehicles over the years. The more impressive one of their work was they did a hack of an unaltered vehicle over the air. They did a Jeep Grand Cherokee with a Wired journalist driving on camera. And the result from Fiat Chrysler of America, who owns Jeep, was they issued a patch for this, but you had to download it and put it on a USB key or get a USB key in the mail. And very few people did it, in fact. They did a little Band-Aid on the Sprint network so that even if the car didn't get patched, you could still block the attack on the network. But there's other ways to exploit that vulnerability, and you can't trust that Sprint's always going to have that filter there. But what happened was, it's not easy to patch or update that. Since some of these systems can't be patched, depending on the vehicle, they can't be patched.
They can be hacked, but they can't be patched.
Yeah, you can hack them remotely, but you can't fix them remotely. So the only ones that are doing this overtly, some of them have privately committed to it or publicly committed to it, but Tesla can do over-the-air updates. Mercedes and BMW can do over-the-air updates. Ford has claimed they intend to get to over-the-air updates. But otherwise, you're either not updated at all, or you're updated in a way that is very manual and never gets done. I think the last time I checked, only about a third of the Fiat Chryslers actually applied the update.
What are some examples of hacks that you can do that vehicles are vulnerable to?
In that particular attack, they took the dashboard apart and they plugged into the console, but they wanted to show that you can lie to the car because the network is very trusting. There's not security baked into the car's architecture. They assume no one would ever attack it. That was largely dismissed by the auto dealers because they're thinking if you can physically touch the car, it's game over anyhow. You could slash the tires or the brake lines or whatever. But because the software controls everything, they essentially would lie to the car and say, we're in park, we're going 0 miles an hour, hit the automatic parallel park, and you could turn the steering wheel. And the motor on the steering column is very strong. So picture you're driving down the highway and the car rips the steering wheel out of your hands with a hard left turn. In fact, over drinks, they'll tell you that they almost hit a car because usually when they hit the button, it took a few seconds before the car would turn. So they timed it so that they could do it after a tractor trailer, but they claimed it immediately kicked in and went right before the tractor trailer. But because software is manipulated and because these things are inherently trusted, the networks on these cars, they use something called CAN bus, which is controller area network bus. It's just a twisted pair of cables. It's good for noisy environments. It's used in industrial control systems environments. And if nothing's ever going to be remotely attached to the car, it's probably safe enough. The challenge isn't so much the presence of software. It's in the growing number of lines of software. It's that we started adding remote connectivity.
That's the thing. I mean, what you're describing is the ways in which you can locally hack something, but if it's remotely accessible, then all those hacks all of a sudden become available to someone sitting in their basement in Dubai or wherever. Not that Dubai has basements. It's all beautiful penthouses and
I've been there now. It is beautiful. The first remote attack surface was, I think, the tire pressure monitors that were required in the state of California for fuel economy reasons. It's a really short range thing, but you couldn't get on the CAN bus through weaknesses in that. Then we added Bluetooth for your phone. Some things use near field communication. But then you did GPRS and radio, so you could do things for over the navigation systems.
There are lots of points of entry.
Well, the real coup de grace, though, is 4G LTE Wi-Fi standard in every vehicle from GM and others, right? Yeah. So once you're on the internet, you can reach out and touch someone from anywhere in the world.
Yeah. So what are you guys doing? What is I Am the Cavalry? What are you doing? What is happening at a regulatory, legislative level to deal with this issue? Because I think you guys this is an area where you guys have had also a lot of success.
Right.
With some of the manufacturers.
On our first birthday for I Am the Cavalry, by the way, is 100% volunteer. Mostly white hat hackers that were concerned about public safety and human life. Our basic problem statement was our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas affecting public safety and human life. So we started specific projects for the Internet of Things that affect safety. So we had an automotive security project, a medical device project, public infrastructure, and consumer IoT. Those have gotten even more fractured since then because they're so specialized. But our idea was, instead of being a pointing finger at past failures or fixing a single flaw in a single device from a single manufacturer, we wanted to hack policy. We wanted to change the whole industry. We wanted to be a helping hand. And what we realized is we can keep bringing technical prowess and be ignored and getting adversarial with them, or we could build the diplomacy skills and use empathy and translation and education. So it was a slower path, but it was ultimately more effective at getting to real results. So on our first birthday, we published this thing called the 5-Star Cyber Safety Framework for Connected Vehicles. It was an open letter to the 20 OEMs for car makers, and essentially said, look, you've been masters of your domain. You've been making cars safer for 100 years. We're masters of our domain in cybersecurity. Now that our domains have collided, we believe we'd be safer sooner if we worked together. And the 5 idea was not meant to be a rating system. It was just to bring together the stakeholders of the car makers, the regulators, the insurers, the lawyers, the customers, the dealers, everybody, to talk about the idea that if you're going to connect cars to the internet or to each other, you had to have these minimum 5 capabilities. The basic idea is all systems fail. Here's 5 ready postures towards failure. They have some fancy names, but if you squint, it's basically tell your customers how you avoid failure. Tell researchers you'll take help avoiding failure without suing them. How do you capture, study, and learn from failure? How do you have a prompt and agile response to failure? And how do you contain and isolate failure? So to put a little bit more language on that, we wanted people to advertise their safety by design programs, so I could choose the car company that cared most about my safety and my family's safety. Number 2 is, do you have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program inviting researchers acting in good faith to hack your stuff without being sued, right? The third one's really important, which is, do you have tamper-evident, forensically sound evidence capture? Think like a black box for cars like we have in airplanes. Mm-hmm. The privacy guys, by the way, are fighting that one. We're not looking to record the cabin conversations. We're looking to see, is there any evidence of tampering or hacking?
Why are the privacy guys fighting that?
They're afraid that it's just another way to spy on people or whatnot. But you can do this in a way that has nothing to do with the passengers or the
There are already
locations.
so many ways to spy on people.
Oh, there's like 20 ways to spy on people in cars.
Who was it? Was it Ford's CEO that said that? Or GMs were already following you or listening to your OnStar? What was it? I can't remember.
I don't remember who said it.
It was at some conference.
Yeah. The fourth one is, do you have secure updates, ideally over the air? And the fifth one is, do you separate critical systems from non-critical systems? Because who cares if you can hack the stereo like Chris and Charlie did?
Or the AC.
I mean, they came in through the Uconnect little computer in the dashboard, so that's how they hacked it. Who cares if you can change the stereo or the AC? But what you care about is, why does that non-critical system have access to the brakes?
Yeah.
So when they disabled the vehicle on a highway and tractor trailer was coming up fast on the Wired reporter, he was scared. People made fun of him and said, "Oh, well, you just pull over to the shoulder," but there wasn't a shoulder, and the car stopped responding to him. So you don't want to have such a soft target like the information entertainment console be able to do something to the physical functionality of the car.
But it's also a rethink. It's a total it's an entirely new way of thinking about how to build your system.
I mean, you could build this in such a way where you get all the benefits, but you've mitigated many of these risks. Or one of the ways we drew a picture of a submarine for that last one. You can have a flood in one compartment without sinking the whole thing. But right now, you get on any part of the CAN bus, you get on every part of the CAN bus. And that's basically the real issue.
And what you're talking about is a basic sound principle of building robust systems where it's the same thing in financial markets. That's what Glass-Steagall was in financial markets, essentially. I mean, the same thing. It's about separating commercial from retail. Same idea that you don't have a critical event in one part of the system doesn't create a critical event across the entire network.
Like, do you know where the term firewall comes from?
No.
There were fires in Chicago, and once a building caught on fire,
in the 19th century, you're talking about then?
Like physical firewall. The term firewall. When one caught on fire, everything on the block would catch on fire. So they started introducing, masonry.
Interesting.
To isolate that you lose at most one building, right? So it was meant to be a segmentation strategy initially. Same thing happened in Amsterdam. They lost entire neighborhoods because buildings were too tightly coupled together. So to me, it's really just, these are things that if you knew that you were going to make a connected vehicle, we would have designed it differently. What we did is we took a legacy design, and because we wanted connectivity, we slapped it on before it was merited or properly done.
And that's across the board. That's the SCADA systems as well, the ICS systems.
Yes. One thing we talked about yesterday is you said, well, why aren't you more concerned about cars? And I said, well, there's a little bit of a learning curve, right? If you want to hack the hospitals, you just have to use normal attack tools on Windows XP. There's a small hurdle to learning the cars, right? If you know how to hack a Windows PC, you won't necessarily know how to hack a car. But if you play around with it a little bit, and now there's a bunch more tools. A friend of ours wrote the car hacker handbook. He does this thing called open garages. He's now taken that Metasploit attack tool I told you about and linked a lot of his free attack tools for cars into it. But at DEF CON last year, the largest hacker conference in the world, we had a hacking contest in the car hacking village. And a kid who's never touched a car before was drunk off his butt on his 21st birthday. He turned 21 that week. And despite never having touched this stuff, he did so well in the contest, he won. So somebody's never touched this before. Granted, he's got a hacker aptitude. But he learned enough about CAN bus and car stuff in basically one day.
Yeah, that's a completely unacceptable level of vulnerability.
It's not easy, but it's not super hard. So there are barriers to entry here, but those barriers are eroding.
Since we're talking about computers on wheels, let's touch a little bit on something that you put me onto, which are John Deere tractors. Let's talk a little bit about that because I think that's wild.
It doesn't just have to be John Deere, but
right,
John Deere's in the news a lot on this. Yeah,
but people know what John Deere tractors are, and we're laughing, but don't take it. Don't take the laugh is from mine at least. It's nervous laughter.
There's a lot of discussion around hacking and customizing and right to repair on tractors, and John Deere's in a bit of a legal battle with its owners on what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do and how they're licensing their software. But if you squint past all that, one of the things I think is a material risk to food supply, global food supply, is we have consolidated agricultural technology. Like big farms, very, very few farmers have to do the work to feed many, many, many people. And that consolidates risk, right? Just think of the financial risk, right? And if you were to, there's a term we call bricking, like you disable or you render it useless. You disable a device. So it's not that you're hacking it and listening and spying. It's that you're just rendering it ineffective or dysfunctional. If you were to brick a single John Deere tractor, it'll be out of commission. Who cares? They'll send you a new one, or they'll send a technician, they'll fix it. But if you were to brick several John Deere tractors during the key harvest period of a key crop, or several, you could ruin the whole crop. And because we're so consolidated, depending on what that crop is and how widespread your damage is, if you're a financial criminal, you could definitely manipulate the market on that. But if you were someone more nefarious, you could massively disrupt the food supply for the Western world. So I think that's a lower probability one, but it's not very hard to do. These tractors aren't just smart tractors. Some of them are driverless tractors. So that dependence again. Now maybe they have some tractors that can come in instead, or maybe they have some backups, and I hope they do. But when we place so much dependence on such undependable things, we can really magnify the cost of failure.
So there are a number of things that we depend on. We depend on waste and sewage systems. We depend on water. We depend on water treatment facilities. We depend on the electric grid. Let's talk a little bit about these systems because I read a bit about them, and we could also touch on Stuxnet. We could circle back a little bit on Stuxnet as well because I think Stuxnet is a really fantastic example of the extreme end of the sophistication curve. I mean, Stuxnet was a remarkably sophisticated attack, and I think that's also a good thing to illuminate because it just shows you that it shows you the extent to which even the best type of security you can possibly imagine can't be good enough. So let's actually before we even get to the electric stuff, let's talk about Stuxnet a little bit because I read a ton about it. I read a ton about it, but I didn't read what's her name's book.
Kim Zetter.
Yeah, I didn't read her book, but I read a lot of the stuff that I read other books that dealt with it. So from what I understand, essentially Stuxnet was written in 2011, or it was released into the Iranian nuclear facility around then, which is the Iranian nuclear facility is a sneaker net, which means that it is air gapped. Right, I mean that's
theoretically
correct. Yeah. Theoretically, in other words, that if you want to get onto the Iranian nuclear reactor's network computers, you need to physically introduce the virus through a port of some sort, which means that a human being has to essentially do that, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And they wrote and please, I'm going to say this, and then I want you to clarify for me because you and I have not spoken about this before. But the way I understand Stuxnet is this virus was written to be autonomous, and it evolved according to certain parameters that it was encoded with from the moment it was delivered to what was originally a Microsoft computer. Any kind of basic computer it didn't enter a Siemens system. The Iranian nuclear reactors ran on Siemens equipment, but this virus knew how to move from a Windows environment to a Siemens environment, and once it got to a Siemens environment, it populated. Once it populated, it ran diagnostics of the system, began to it fully understand what a normal operating climate looks like, and then replicated that essentially to the diagnostic tools of the researchers, so that they were looking at a normal operating environment for years, thought that they were looking at normal reactors running, and Stuxnet, meanwhile, was messing with the speeds.
Yeah.
And the United States and Israel literally slowed down the reactor process for years.
Enrichment.
The enrichment, correct. Before the Iranians ever figured out. And then when they figured out, they just kind of blew some switches or whatever, and then that was it. They literally, so when we heard that we slowed down the reactor, we literally, the enrichment, or whatever it's called, the terminology, we literally slowed that down. I mean, to me, when I read that the way that Stuxnet were, I thought, wow. And this virus never communicated during that entire time with home base. It was completely local. which is a remarkable level of intelligence.
I mean, it was very well designed. It was allegedly a collaboration between the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah.
I am not cleared or read in on any of that, but the prevailing belief is Israel was getting very nervous about the nuclear enrichment, uranium enrichment, and wanted to do physical action. And allegedly, the U.S. convinced them to try electronic means. In some ways, there's a lot of regret around that because in an attempt to prevent nuclear war, we may have escalated cyber war.
Because, why don't you explain that, what that significance is? I mean, the fact that Stuxnet is now in the wild.
Stuxnet had been in the wild, but it was very well written to pay attention to markers. It knew what it was looking for, knew what to do when it found it. Great lengths were gone to make that do little harm. But some of the unintended consequences, for example, is that once that source code is out there,
right,
your enemy, unlike a grenade that you throw at your enemy and it blows up, your enemy can pick this back up, harvest it for parts, and use it against you. So parts of Stuxnet showed up in other attacks against allies. Mm-hmm. There were retaliation attacks as well, like the Saudi Aramco attacks, or Dooku, or Gosser, or Flame. So there were a bunch of attacks, and you started seeing or countries that didn't really have a cyber warfare presence very quickly go from 0 to 100 in their capability. In fact, Michael Joseph Gross wrote a piece in Vanity Fair about this very thing, that Stuxnet's attempt to maybe slow physical war may have caused the cyber war. And almost zero people read it because it came out the day after the Snowden revelations hit. So the entire intended target audience was distracted by a fairly significant intelligence development.
Well, I wanted to bring that up because I just think it's in and of itself it's a remarkable story. To me it highlights it's diametrically opposed to what we were talking about before, which before we were basically saying, look at how exposed and vulnerable we are. You don't need to be a genius. You don't need to be anybody special.
Stuxnet's damn impressive, though.
Oh, so impressive. And I think for me, why I wanted to mention that is to really highlight the extent to which human ingenuity has created attack tools and strategies that are beyond. It was certainly beyond my imagination. Now let's go back to where I was at, which was SCADA and ISS. So SCADA are systems control, administration, data acquisition, something like that. I can't remember what it stands for. Let's talk about SCADA, ICS. These are industrial control systems, and our water treatment, sewage, and specifically the electric grid, which is obviously a very frightening thing. And yet all of these systems are less exposed than the hospitals and the cars, correct?
Different exposure.
Different type of exposure.
Yeah. And there's a learning curve there. The broader category is industrial control systems. SCADA is a specific subset of that. There's other terms you'll hear like programmable logic controller or PLC, things like that. And in fact, that Showdown tool we looked at, that's a great tool for finding these.
That's what we found when we were on the phone.
Right. So if you look at that, to hack and navigate these systems, you need to know some things about the systems and how they're architected. But once you learn them, you can do it. There's a pretty robust white hat hacker community around this. They've been doing it for a very long time. I just went to one of their bigger conferences in January in Miami. It's called S4. This was S4X17 because of 2017. They refer to it as the lost decade because there was a decade of them, banging their head against the wall trying to get people to listen, and nobody listened. And now they're starting to listen. I think in part they were right, but they were early. So there's a lot of talent there, and if people want to learn how to do this stuff, you can learn pretty quickly and take training. But there is a learning curve. So the random person that wants to do harm is going to have to learn some stuff.
This is another example of a place where software was written pre-internet. Not necessarily pre the internet, but pre-connected to the internet. So some of these systems were never built to be connected, and then they got connected to the internet.
Right. There's reasons the connectivity is happening. There's other, it depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. But one thing people forget about is there's this notion of IT, which we're used to in enterprise security, infrastructure technology. There's also OT, which is operational technology. And these are things like pistons and nuclear, enrichment rods and centrifuges and whatnot, HVAC systems. So as we started connecting IT and OT more, they don't really even speak the same network protocols. So some of these things just lack a robust security market or whatnot. Other things, they're trying to do more predictive maintenance. So there's a business value to having telemetry sent from these devices. If you can tell that this turbine's spinning a little hot, or it's out of balance. You might order the part to replace it because it might take a long time to get it. So there's reasons we're starting to add connectivity, but once you connect it, you make it exposed. And if you don't have the necessary security countermeasures, then you're making it very exposed. I think one thing that the white hat hacking community doesn't say enough is, just like I showed you on Showdown, you don't have to necessarily be a hacker. If this device is directly accessible on the internet, you can Google the maintenance passwords, because they often have hard-coded passwords again. So you don't necessarily have to hack it. You can just log into it. And as long as you've read the manual, you can know what to do with it. I think I told you one of them was the Department of Justice unsealed a court case where Iranian hackers successfully manipulated a water dam, a slough, in upstate New York. Now, there was no water in it, and at most it would have flooded a golf course, but it showed someone who tried to do it and succeeded in manipulating it. So, it's hard to prosecute foreign adversaries, but they did,
Well, it's widely assumed now by the U.S. government. Assumed is not even a strong enough word. I mean, they just simply operate under the assumption and fully believe that at the very least, the Chinese and the Russians have already infiltrated and mapped out completely the entire electric grid, the three major grids in the United States. And if they want to implement an attack, I'm getting that from my reading of Koppel's book.
So the U.S. grid is privately owned and operated, and it's kind of fragmented.
Very fragmented. Yeah. An example of deregulation without proper re-regulation.
You know what? Let's not get into it too much. But one of my observations during this Health and Human Services Cybersecurity Task Force was there are strengths and weaknesses to different countries' approaches to these things. But in the face of something like ransomware, the fact that the U.S. has a privatized, fragmented health delivery approach, in theory, gives us more innovation, maybe some more competition, but it also makes our sphere and span of control for response under emergency a lot harder. So the National Health Services in the UK, they have some strengths and some weaknesses in theirs, but they have complete span of control.
Exactly.
So there will come a time when we properly price.
Right. What you're basically saying is that you have all these, you have a very large attack surface, but it's not under the control of one entity. One entity is not incentivized to patch all of those holes. But there's a lot of good about in terms of how the electric grid was deregulated. It did drop prices. It helped to drop prices, but that has also led to a lot of these companies that don't have the money to secure their infrastructure. And their infrastructure is part of a larger part of a larger network. So if they go down, everyone goes down, and that's a huge problem. And they're looking to find ways to try to pool money together to sort of crowd fund within the industry's security measures. But it's a huge challenge.
I listen to your. I love this podcast, by the way, and I've listened to all your episodes prior to this. And I'm not even a finance guy, but what I really liked is your field, especially in financial risk and systemic risk.
Systemic.
You're drawing on some of the very same principles that the best and brightest in cybersecurity are starting to stumble into, like complex systems theory, complex adaptive systems. We are starting to. We lack the models. You're talking about we have models in financial services, how to hedge risk and how to diversify. And I'm a total neophyte in your world, but as I listen to it, we know what levers do which things, even though they're complex systems. You have a fairly robust understanding of them. Sometimes we ignore the warnings, or we lack the political will to do the things we should be doing. In cybersecurity, we don't even have the models figured out yet. But what we do have is, on any measure, whether it's the number of adversaries this year versus last year, or types of adversaries, it's gone up. The number of connected devices, gone up, down, or the same. Well, it's going up. The volume and variety of connectivity, getting better or worse. So whatever independent measurement you could make, the situation is growing out of control. And we don't have good models for this. So what we don't know is, would a failure in one area cascade into others, which is why I've been so focused on these primitives. I'm a little worried that it's not that individual failures will be that bad. It's that they're going to be really hard to fix. One of the problems with automobiles, with medical devices, with industrial control systems, with water facilities, with high-speed rail is when by the time you've noticed you have a fix, if it can't be fixed quickly with a software update, if it's an architectural thing or a physical limitation, it could be, the response time could be, it's exploited very quickly, very broadly, but it may take months or years or even decades to replace some of these things.
Oh man, that goes back to the medical devices. It also feeds into, when we're talking about the electric grid, I think it's either it's the transformers or it's there's some very large key pieces of equipment that literally from the moment you order them to when they get delivered, it's over a year's time, which is why if you actually, the grid stuff is really frightening, because if you compromise the grid and you break it and you sort of do major damage to it, it could take a very long time to piece that together again.
Yeah, one thing I want to calm people down a little bit on the grid, it doesn't mean you can rely on this, but nation states have, in fact, probed each other and they know the weaknesses. But almost like in the nuclear deterrence model and game theory, in many ways our adversaries are as vulnerable as we are. They have a few distinct advantages here or there, and we have a few distinct advantages here or there. But nation states tend to have norms and treaties. We have this thing called the Talent Manual, which is kind of like the rules of the road for cyberspace. We just, at the Atlantic Council, my day job and think tank, we just helped launch the 2.0 version of that. So we have agreements among nations for, what's a non-combatant target, what's critical infrastructure. You don't go hitting hospitals. There are some rules of the road honored amongst nation states. A lot of my research and the reason I looked at Anonymous and Cyber Caliphate and other things is those people are non-deterrable. You can't use economic sanctions. They don't care about UN norms and treaties. So if you make a little XY axis where the vertical is how capable your adversary is, someone like a Russia or China are so good that even if you doubled our defenses, they'd be tall enough to jump over that wall. What you have to look at the other axis is intent, right? How willing are they to use it, and how emboldened are they? And for me, that's someone like Trick, right? That he's a high intent, low capability actor. And if you raised our hygiene, if we did slightly better security on these things, if we didn't have so many known vulnerabilities and low-hanging fruit, if you raise defenses high enough, you can exhaust the attack capacity of those high intent, low capability actors. So something like the grid doesn't bother me as much because it's a little harder than these non-state actors can muster at the moment. And even though the nation states could do it, they're as vulnerable, or they'd be violating, other mechanisms and controls we have. It doesn't mean I'm unconcerned. It's just of all the things I'm concerned about.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you and I first spoke, that was actually a center of the conversation, because I was like, Josh, what about these SCADA systems, man? And you're like, listen, that's,
I'm just trying to rank order my concerns.
Right, and it makes absolute sense. So absolutely. I mean, and there's been a lot of awareness built up around the grid from Koppel's book specifically. I mean, that didn't exist at all before. We've already seen examples of attacks like Ukraine, which is a great example, though.
I'm surprised how few people heard about this. I mean, we talk about Russian hacking of, DNC and things like that, but we now have the first confirmed. We've known about the possibility of this for years, but last year was the first confirmed successful attack using electronic means on a power grid in Ukraine. They didn't destroy the equipment; they disabled it. Had they destroyed it, it would have taken a lot longer.
And they could have if they wanted to.
They could have destroyed it, absolutely. In fact, Google this attack type called Aurora. Not the Google Aurora attack, which is an espionage thing out of China, but there's
and not Aurora Borealis.
No. But Aurora is just a property of physics that, you can do serious damage. There's a demonstration video from Idaho National Labs. They're using a diesel generator. But, they use the Aurora attack, and this thing starts shaking and spitting oil and throwing pistons, and it's sometimes hard to find the video. But we know of logical attacks that can have physical harm on industrial control systems and power. We're just kind of hoping that most of the adversaries who are capable of doing that would not do that. Now,
and again, the functionality aspect of it is really simple. I mean, you could just do something as simple as turn up a pump on and off, on and off, on and off till it breaks. Mm-hmm. And we've actually seen that happen in sewage facilities.
Right.
All right. Sorry.
So, I mean, one of the reasons I caution against escalation in cyberspace is the state of nature is a state of war, right? Hobbes said nasty, brutish, in short. I like to say the state of cyber is a state of offense. It just really predisposes itself that offense is very, very easy doing the attack. Defense is really, really hard. So it's logical that most nation states are tripling down on offensive capabilities. But it's really reckless because if you completely ignore defense, then you're opening yourself up to more accidents and adversaries from these lower talent, but highly motivated actors.
Well, that's the same thing that I covered in my space warfare conversation with Joan Fries. There's literally, space is a perfect example of a place that it's purely offensive. There is no defensive measure. You're not going to defend your satellite against an incoming missile or other satellite that's coming to hit it or anything. I mean, it's that's I couldn't agree with you more.
But if we do escalate and saber rattle, I call it cyber saber rattling. If you do that, one of the things we forget, because we assume that our offense is world class and unmatched, or that we're just as good as any other nation state. But what we haven't factored is we are one of the most connected nations and dependent nations. And on a toe-for-toe thing, not that I expect an escalation in cyberspace with Russia, but they have hardened their grid to some of those weaknesses that we've discussed, like Aurora. We haven't. They have centralized control. We have fragmented.
Correct.
And
they have centralized control. Yeah, absolutely.
Most of our same thing economy
with
is dependent on things. Most of our hospitals. So you have pockets of hyperconnectivity in Singapore or Dubai, but overall, pound for pound, the U.S. stands the most to lose from an escalation in cyberspace.
That gets to a much bigger paradigm, something that I've just touched on the edges in different shows, which is Americans, we love our freedom and we love living in a society that our founding principles are ones that respect this notion of individuality, individual mobility, freedom, commercial systems, commercial relationships, and that's directly threatened by our geopolitical competitors who are in a much better position to be adversarial by being centralized. They are not as they're more fragile societies, but when they're working, they really push us in a direction that it goes, I think, against a lot of our values, which just gets into the whole government surveillance issue, which is we have all this government surveillance and we allow it because the threats that are, whether it's non-state actors, terrorists, governments that don't share our particular values when it comes to the way that we organize our society, are able to operate more effectively, and that's a real big problem. At this point, there are just so many other things that I kind of just want to. Maybe we can just kind of run through some of these, because I think a lot of people, one of the things that their mind would go to would be aviation, air traffic control systems. What are kind of what are the threats there? What are the things we should be concerned about there?
I'll do like a lightning round, I guess.
Cool. All right, let's do that.
There's a lot of issues, but the ones that come top to mind, GPS systems can be spoofed. And you can
explain spoofing for our audience.
GPS is implicitly trusted, so as long as you transmit louder than others, you can lie. It's used in maritime hacking as well to take shipping container fleets out of their shipping lanes, maybe towards piracy. That's right. There's some work by a hacker named Renderman who's done some work on GPS spoofing in aviation. One of the ones that gets less talk is there's a technology called collision avoidance systems in a lot of this aircraft. It's meant that when it's almost like the V2V protocol or vehicle-to-vehicle protocol idea in connected vehicles. The idea is that if two aircraft get too close to each other, they can take evasive maneuvers. That also is done in an insecure, spoofable way. So you could lie to that. Imagine flying a drone near the end of the runway, either before or after takeoff, to cause an evasive action in a precarious moment. So a lot of these technologies have a heavy investment in hardware and firmware and software. They're harder to replace, and they really didn't think of the threat modeling or the adversary resilience testing that a hacker's eye view might bring to bear. So those are the top two. You could do denial of service on air traffic control or ticketing systems. You've seen a couple of major airlines have an entire...
Delta consistently.
United, Delta, Virgin. There have been a few, Lufthansa, I think, that have had day-long or more
we
outages.
Haven't been told whether those were DDoS
I'm not claiming they're hacking. It could have been a database failure. It could have been a patch, a software glitch. It could have been a power outage. But the bottom line is these are brittle systems.
Absolutely.
And if you wanted to, you could probably think how much money they lose in a single day. So it's not a life and limb thing, but it's a soft target.
But that's also another thing. These things aren't cash cows. These airlines aren't cash cows.
Razor-thin margins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the scary thing. And we're worried about securing the actual physical plane from a terrorist. And I think I really want to drive that point home. This episode is all about helping people understand that our antiquated notions of security are increasingly useless. I mean, that we need to be thinking...
They're incomplete.
that's a much more fair point. I was being hyperbolic.
But look at all the physical security reactions we had to 9/11. Of all of them, many of them compromise liberties. Many of them we never shed. Many of them are, nonsense, and they're
the freaking body
ineffective.
scanner was one of the most absurd things that TSA has done.
But one of the ones that made sense, like 80-20 rule, was reinforcing the cockpit door. Right? What a good move, right? Easy to do. You don't have to change the chassis. Pretty high benefit for pretty low cost. There's no civil liberties infringements there. What I'm looking for some of these things is what's the cyber equivalent of reinforcing the cockpit door? If we can't fix really hard things, we're trying to find those primitives or the 80-20 rules that you can do. And sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not. But think of all the work we did there for physical security, civil liberties, and cockpit doors. And then think of the fact that to save on the weight of commercial airlines, we collapsed the avionics cabling and the infotainment cabling. So if you can hack any of the systems or influence any of the systems
Wait,
from
go
the
back. Whoa, hold on.
I didn't tell you that one yesterday.
No, hold on. Hold on. So to save money on the drag, essentially the weight of the aircraft, what do they do?
All right. So I want to be very clear so I don't mislead you. When the 787 Dreamliner was being built, the weight of a plane massively affects fuel economy.
Sure.
So one of the ways to cut weight was cabling is very heavy. So they collapsed the avionics cabling with the infotainment cabling.
Oh, so they run them both together.
Now,
so you can get into the avionics cabling through the infotainment
So there is shared
devices?
circuitry, right? Now, you can add logical separations and filtering and virtual machines and VLANing and things.
So I can plug a dongle into my screen when I'm sitting and watching X-Men, and that's what you're saying.
So there was a researcher who said some things and lost some credibility on the fact that he could hack or get through the Wi-Fi system and infotainment into the avionics. He got greeted at the ground with FBI folks. And there's some apocryphal stories around that, but as we've collapsed the cabling, they're sharing circuitry. They may have other forms of isolation, and maybe they're good enough, and some of them are doing a good enough job. But we have to make sure that as we change the future of air travel, we haven't undermined all those physical TSA cockpit door physical measures by being lax on maybe some of the technology or cybersecurity measures. So many of these aircraft have done a good job at doing logical isolation and segmentation, but you can easily imagine someone screws that up. And yes,
I think a good example for people in their
much for lightning round on aviation.
I'm like, what?
I forgot I didn't tell you that.
A good example though I think that can really personalize this for people is don't use your master account ever when you're on your computer. You should be on a user with less privileges, so that if someone
that's a logical segmentation.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Simple things that you can do. Always update your software. Like there's simple things that you can always do as an individual that will eliminate 80% of potential attackers.
I call it elective attack surface. Right. There's a certain amount, if you want to have the value of
I like
connectivity.
how every time I say something, you've already thought about it. Well, you're like, let me give you the technical terminology.
I mean, we don't even have standard lingo for this. So it's very impressive that you're even coming up with these but yeah, the idea is having a front door in your house creates a way for bad people to get in, but you still need a way in and out of your house. So you're going to have some level of attack surface and complexity. I think one of the challenges is we haven't measured or cared about that and realized how toxic that is. So what I want to get rid of is the optional elective complexity, elective attack surface.
Well, in that kind of a sense, also in some ways as well, you could. I mean, I don't think I remember. I forget where I heard this, or if I heard it just from my own bicameral mind just now. It just came through. But locks on your door are a suggestion. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, someone can still break down your door, but you will eliminate the vast majority of people who would just, oh yeah, it's open. Let me just peek in here. Oh, there's some money on the table. There's that, so like that, you eliminate all of those people, which are like 80% or more of the people, by just having a lock.
It's also a function of time. Right.
And time,
so
absolutely.
If you can make it
and
take
expertise,
time
and
expertise. So how many people can pick that lock? How long does it take them? In fact, we used to measure safes, like bank safes or even personal safes, not in can it be broken, but it was measured in the amount of time it would take a master safecracker to break in. So you want to buy 8 hours for someone to notice they're trying to break into it. So security is often not it's almost never a binary thing. It's about how much harder are you making it.
Yeah. I mean, and in some ways, not a perfect analogy, but that's why we have cameras. There's a camera will not physically stop anyone from attacking your home, but it's a type of a deterrent because of the post facto.
Look, I took a train here. Trains have this thing called positive train control, kind of like a collision avoidance type thing. So that is hackable.
Well, that happened in Belgium on the trolley system. That happened in like 2009. Some kid hacked their trolley system and sent the train. No one died, thank God. If I remember correctly. I don't know if I'm citing that correctly, but I think it was in Belgium, and I think it was some kid that did it.
The London Tube system has no conductor anymore. It's all automated. So, as we become more dependent, we become more exposed.
And vulnerable. So, is there something that I've left off so far that you... I mean, I don't know. There are a lot of other things that we could get into. I know where your area of expertise is. I mean, I don't know. Have you thought at all about the vulnerability of our information? Not from the physical system standpoint, but from the propaganda standpoint, the vulnerability of our information systems. Now, the whole big thing now has been this whole the Russian hack that affected the election, the Hillary Clinton emails, the fake news on Facebook, but just on a larger level, the fact that we're increasingly intermediating our experience of the world through these screens. Right now we have the GUI, the graphical user interface that we've had for a long time. We're quickly moving into AR, VR, which is much more immersive, and the fact that a more immersive environment is an environment that is equally, if not more, hackable in the future. How do we deal with? Will you think about that on a more philosophical level? I know that that's not part of your work, but
it's a curiosity of mine, but I haven't put a significant amount of time into it. I enjoy my VR headset.
What do you have? You use Oculus?
No, I got the
Samsung.
I'm a big zombie fan, so I got the PlayStation 1 for Resident Evil.
When did you get that?
Very recently.
And it's really good?
I got very sick for the first time I played it, and then I got used to it.
It's freaky stuff, man.
It's incredibly immersive. Horror is the perfect use.
I want to get someone on the show. I met this really brilliant girl. She's like 24 years old, and she has a VR company. And we were having this conversation around what I was saying, which is, and she knows some people in this area. Actually, just one specific person doing work in this area, and I would love to get him on. I kind of just think that the future of VR isn't replicating experiences that we have in the three-dimensional space, but rather the intersection between neuroscience and understanding of chemical processes of the brain and these light frequencies and audio wavelengths. In other words, hacking the brain to replicate neurochemical experiences that you have with drugs and sort of tripping out on a VR headset.
Related to what you're saying, we met. I convened this thing called CyberMedRx. It was just a multi-stakeholder summit on cybersecurity. Because usually, doctors talk to doctors, or biomed services talk to biomed services, or device makers talk to device makers. They never talk to each other. So we invited a whole bunch of stakeholders to present to each other in 5-minute flash talks, like an unconference. And one of the guys blew my mind. We ended up sitting together by accident on a flight from Boston to California. He was going to an AI brain chemistry type thing. And basically, he's at Mass General in a research role. And he's developed a device that goes subcranial on the brain to help.
Invasive?
Which is it's being used for PTSD and certain brain disorders to do electroshock to do mood alteration. So if you're too aggressive or if you're too depressed. So he's doing electrostimulation in a research capacity. And when we talked about that, I'm like, how do you keep the battery alive on that thing? Or how do you do encrypted technology? Because his big concern is it's a privacy violation. If someone knew you had it, they could discriminate against you for job stuff. And I said, I have much bigger concerns.
So this is a remote. So this is embedded, permanently embedded.
Subcranial. in your skull.
Just on there's a medical question here.
This is a real thing.
Okay, so hold on. So are you saying, but it's inserted through, they drill a hole in the head and then they plug it?
He
and
takes
that's
a cap
in there?
off your skull, puts it in there, closes you up.
And how do they recharge?
So he said the recharging thing is you have to sit stationary in a chair.
Oh my God.
For a certain amount of time to recharge it because the battery drain is very severe. And I said, so how do you do the secure communications? Because encryption takes power, right? It's computationally intensive. He goes, oh, we can't. So I said, you're concerned about privacy. I'm concerned about manipulation. Like, what if you wanted to enrage your opponent at in a negotiation, or what if you wanted to depress
that's some
them?
high level shit,
And
Josh.
he said, you know what, Josh? He's like,
that's some high level creative thinking on
one of his
part.
trial guys is using it. He's young and he's using it to get high. So he's manipulating his own settings to get high. So it's, to me, as a geek, I'm loving like the fact that this guy is innovating in this way because
wait, how does he know? How does he even know how does he know the neurochemistry?
He's just fooling around.
He's just messing around. He has no idea what he's doing. He's just pressing buttons.
Yes,
that's crazy.
So I was both. The one half of my brain is like, this is
like
amazing.
Taking Ambien and walking around the city.
The other half is, this is terrible, and think of the manipulation you can do. But I think one thing to maybe ground all this, because we've talked about a lot of negative things, that technology, if he can help, reduce the harmful effects of PTSD for soldiers, or if he can give someone who has debilitating mood problems, a better life. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to work. This is an experiment. But these technologies, we do them because they have the potential to dramatically improve the human condition. And the one thing I try to remind people about, even in the cavalry, I think we have the right balance in our tone. Typically, we've been pretty negative on this discussion. But the reason that the Department of Transportation was so aggressively pushing connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles, it's pretty simple. The stats show about 100 U.S. citizens per day, every day, die in a car accident. And 96% of those are due to human error and human choice. So when you talk to the former administrator, Rosekind, he would say, and that is why I am determined to accelerate autonomous and semi-autonomous, because drivers are terrible. They're drunk, they're distracted, they're texting, they're in a fight with their friend. Drivers suck sometimes, right? If he can get rid of that 96%, that's 96 people every day that get to stay alive and enjoy their families. So his point was, a single hack, who cares? One hack, he's like, we saved 95 other people today. But what I had to remind him, and this is the rub, I said, I agree with you. On the whole, these cars are safer, the crash survivability is better, and the autonomous will dramatically improve life. But if we're cavalier about the cybersecurity, one exotic death in a connected vehicle will shatter my mother-in-law's confidence to trust these things. And your dream is postponed by 5 years easy. He's like, all right, that's a good point.
But also, I mean, that's a great point, which is that you're making a derivative statement, which is that forget even the actual loss,
it's not the number
loss
of deaths.
Confidence.
Yes.
Absolutely, it goes back to the hospital thing around one person has his chemo treatment screwed up, or his radiation, or his blood type.
Right.
Chart messed up, and now he's like terrified about going to the hospital. And even if he goes, it's going to be a horrific experience at a time when you need to be able to relax.
And doctors will retreat to safer, more trusted methods.
Forget it. Then that's
and then
brilliant,
we're really
Josh.
in big trouble.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
That is a brilliant point. That is because they're already traumatized by malpractice. And there are so many unnecessary procedures that drive up costs in the hospital that happen because of concerns about
the
liability.
facts won't matter. It's all going to be perception.
Very important point. Also, with respect to cars, I think what's interesting, and this is so actually, dude. So, have you seen Rogue One?
Yeah.
Okay, you know what I love about that movie more than anything else? First of all, that killed The Force Awakens. Force Awakens sucked by comparison to Rogue One. Do you agree with me? No, you don't. You like both. No, obviously. I like both too. But
Rogue One is close to Empire Strikes Back in quality. Close, not as good, but close.
You love. I
love
Empire.
Rogue One.
Yeah, Empire Strikes Back is amazing.
Empire's the best.
Okay, so but Rogue One, I'm going to tell you what it was for me. It is so freaking analog. I mean, even the Death Star plans were physically handed. It looked like a tape drive. I mean, so what? And why am I bringing that up? And and all the buttons on the consoles, and the fact that we're going to move in light speed to we're going to physically, as if you're in a Ferrari. You know what I mean? Like the linearity of it. Why bring that up? In the 1970s, but still today, to a major degree, I think, certainly in older individuals, they have this sense of technology as being analog. where they think about these systems as like the robots in Star Wars. Each robot was autonomous. It wasn't they weren't all like, networked robots. These cars are not individual car drivers. Like they are one giant network. So like
that's the vision. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that already now the case? I mean, that's the Tesla fleet. There, if one car on the road learns something, all of them learn it.
Oh, they're sharing information, but
right.
They're not acting as a coordinated fleet yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Interesting. So
they're learning from each other, but they're not causal to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But vehicle to vehicle.
So they're not fully aware of where every other vehicle is on the road.
So that's part of the V2V, which is vehicle to vehicle protocol, and V2I, which is vehicle to infrastructure. Without a massive overview of this, the quintessential points is we spent a good thing this time is way out in front 13 years ago, I think 14 now, they started designing security into the protocol. So it's a secure protocol. But what they've completely ignored is that if you can't trust a single car participating in the network, then you can't trust the answers from the network.
Right.
So the real weak points in V2V and V2I right now is that you can't trust individual cars to not be spoofing or deceptive. And the roadside equipment often has like Wi-Fi with no password.
And the roadside equipment is the more concerning aspect because the cars are replaced every so often. Yeah. The roadside equipment, the infrastructure is replaced less often. Is that correct? Am I incorrect on that?
I think it depends on the roadside equipment, but some of these things, the reason that there's no security is almost by choice if you look at some of the manufacturers because they want low paid
overhead.
Well, they want low paid technicians to be able to administer them without a lot of work.
Exactly.
Yeah, a lot of hassle. What we have to do is stop thinking connectivity is always good and it's always safe. And we have to, I think to use your term from the financial markets, we have to price this, right?
We have to price the risk.
We have to price it, render it visible, and then make informed risk decisions. Because ultimately everything's a risk decision. And my basic contention, though, is we lack the information to make an informed risk decision at the moment.
So let me ask you this now, because we ran through all this stuff. What is most encouraging to you? You guys are doing really great work, and it's really wonderful. You're just one person, you're just one organization, so you alone are not going to solve this problem. But I think you set a great example. What's most promising? What kind of excites you that you've seen? I mean, you gave, I think, the one example, which was with the FDA. I
told you that.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't mention that in the interview. All right, let's talk about that. That's a great example then.
All right, I'll try to do this short version of the story, but it's told the right way. I actually get choked up about it. But when we launched the Cavalry, I said to the entire room, I said, I want to be honest with you guys. People will have to die first before they'll really listen to us. And the room looked at me cross-eyed, like, then why bother? Why don't we just wait for someone to die first? And I said, look, we want to be ready when that happens. We want to have the trust relationships. We want to have a head start. We have to do the scaffolding now so that we're ready when they're ready. But, eyes wide open, we said people will have to die first. Well, while we started on the cars first, because we thought it was easier because there's only 20 manufacturers versus, thousands of device manufacturers for hospital stuff, the FDA has some incredibly impressive and passionate people there. And once they finally realized how serious this was, they went from 0 to 60 in no time. So we started engaging, teaching each other, training each other, harmonizing our terms. And the original standard of care was until there's proof of harm, they weren't going to take a regulatory action. And all the device makers were waiting to say, well, we have more time. They haven't figured out how they're going to regulate cybersecurity. But there was a Hospira drug infusion pump, a bedside pump that could give you, any sort of drug. And Billy Rios, a really good researcher in this space, found a flaw in it. And he told Hospira he would give them 1 calendar year before he told the public. And somewhere in that calendar year, somebody else found a similar flaw and just told everybody. And the FDA...
Isn't this also the story of someone shorting the stock?
No, that's a different one. That's a bad story.
Okay.
But the Hospira, basically, the FDA realized, okay, if we make it hard for people to do the safe thing, we're buying time for someone to do the unsafe thing. And they got much more engaged. And through that back and forth and empathy and training and all the soft skills that we tend not to have, right before DEF CON again, they issued the first ever, essentially a recall, even though nobody died. And what they came to realize is that in cyberspace, unlike a physical defect that affects maybe a few small percentage of the devices, that this could affect everybody. So what they realized is an unmitigated pathway to harm should be sufficient to trigger a corrective action. And when she told me this, and it was about to go public, I remember feeling like really good sense of victory and like, all right, this is great. And then my little girls came home and they never see me smiling or happy. So they said, Daddy, why are you so happy? And I started explaining it to them. And then halfway through telling them, I just started to weep because it hit me that, wait a second, nobody died. Like, how many years did we save by trying to be diplomats and ambassadors and work with them instead of against them? And it's not that people won't die from hackable medical devices. We're going to have a lot of deaths. It's that moment told every single device manufacturer, oh man, we need to take this seriously now. This can really affect us. I mean, every hospital was told, don't use these things anymore. And their next model wasn't going to come out until December. So that was a real wake-up call. And, to the credit of that group within the FDA and to the credit of all the white hat hackers that decided to use diplomacy instead of technology, just boldly trying to do the right thing actually led to a safer outcome sooner. So now we've kind of morphed our motto to be safer sooner together. And, some hardened hackers think that that's very cliche. But, eventually we're going to figure this out. But the whole goal is to figure it out sooner than later, right? And we can't do it alone, and they can't do it alone. So I'm incredibly encouraged by that. And then later on, they put it in their actual formal guidance. So now it's very clear what they expect. And we probably pulled in that enlightenment moment 3 to 5 years easy. And think how many people will have safer equipment in that extra 3 to 5 year head start. So, we're not going to eliminate the risks, but I think this approach is encouraging. And what's more encouraging is once we had that victory with the Food and Drug Administration, that led to people now listening on the Health and Human Services Hospital project that I just described, the task force. And that also got parts of Congress to ask the Department of Transportation, why aren't you doing what the FDA is doing? So now they're applying pressure to automated vehicles and connected vehicles for cybersecurity. And the Department of Homeland Security noticed, and they put out the strategic principles for enhancing national cybersecurity. And, there's a cascading effect that if you do something productive and pragmatic that makes a dent in one place, you can then pick that up and replicate it elsewhere. So I don't think I am the Cavalry or Atlantic Council or a few of us alone are going to fix everything. But I think sometimes if you see something missing from the world, you have to try to put it in. And hopefully we're creating these positive patterns and these primitives that are going to get us to have these, when the big attack happens, we will have convinced everyone to make those devices patchable. So that'll be a few days of risk instead of a few months of risk.
I think it's also encouraging for the really brilliant, smart, bright people who are able to affect change positively in cyber security in the domain of the internet to see what you're doing. I mean, legitimately speaking, to see that it's encouraging, and it because cynicism is a destructive force.
It's also our defining characteristic in cybersecurity. Yeah.
So, I mean, and I'm glad you're doing this interview. I'm glad you came here, and I'm glad that you're talking about this stuff. And I think education is the educating the public on the threat, the scope of the threat is so essential because I just don't think people really understand it. I think people still are in the mindset of, well, why me? Why would they target me? I'm not worried about myself, and they don't see it. They don't see it as a systemic thing. They don't get the system aspect. You want to add something on that?
I just had this moment, synthesis moment, I guess. But when I was researching Anonymous, one of my big fears, one of the interviews I was doing, he said, "Why are you so
talking
worried?"
about Anonymous, the hack organization,
hacktivism, yeah,
hacktivism.
He said, "Why are you so concerned about this, Josh? From all accounts, they're not very technical. They're not very organized. Why are you worried about this?" And it came down to, I saw a rise of the personal power for any one individual to affect the planet, but I didn't see the compassion, wisdom, or restraint to use that power responsibly. And it really made me nervous. And as we probed at that, the next morning I woke up and I said, if they have that much power, that means I do too. And I think there's an undertone of empowerment in this cyber safety, do-gooder altruism movement, which is that we stopped feeling like we're victims. And the very people and functions that make, our fears so real means that we also have that power. And I think one of the most empowering moments in this is it's the sociologists and the social workers and the soft skills that are really ruling the day here. So we're also showing a different model for contribution. It used to be that you had to be an elite hacker or a super technical, mastery kind of person. But what we're seeing is it takes all shapes and sizes. And as we bring in, that's one of the reasons I love your podcast, as we bring in people who know sociology or anthropology or psychology or finance or critical systems, that's what's making us smarter. So it's not just what we're working on, it's also how we're approaching it.
Working together, interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's going to take. I mean, the easy stuff, we've already solved the easy stuff. The low-hanging fruit has been picked clean. If you want to solve the really hard problems, you're going to have to take really different approaches.
And drop the ego, man. Because there's a lot of ego flying around. A lot of people are trying to get credit for this or that, or just trying to advance themselves and thinking about how we're in a boat together here. And if we're not careful, we're all going to drown.
Yeah, there's
or if we're not, we're all. I mean, not careful. If we don't all have a little bit more respect and humility for just how vulnerable we are, and start working together and stop acting like we're totally independent of one another, we're not gonna get very far.
Yeah, we've got a long way to go, but I think we're starting to find things that work, and we need to amplify those and extend those.
Josh, man, thank you so much for coming on. This was awesome, bro. I know people are gonna love this thing. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. I'm glad I came to the actual studio.
And that was my episode with Josh Corman. I want to thank Josh for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Connor Lynch. Sound engineering was Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening.